great pleasure to introduce you to this panel, Beyond Boundaries. And you have before you, I'll go left to right, we've got Muli Amaye, who's actually teaching. Well, I'm not going to say anything about it. She's actually not from Trinidad, but she looks like a Trini. And she's behaving more and more like a Trini. She's at the University of the West Indies. Debbie Jacob, also not a Trini, but truly a Trini. Anthony Joseph, who's a Trini, British Trini. And Afua, who looks completely like a Trini, but not a Trini. And Alison Donnell, who knows everything about being a Trini and is not a Trini. And Alison Donnell, I just want you to give her and this wonderful panel a huge round of applause. Alison is one of our co-conspirators, and it's a great pleasure to have you, Alison. Thank you very, very much. See you at the end of the session.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Carolyn. So thank you, everybody, for coming this morning. I think the fact that I didn't pick up my mic may be a sign that there was a very good party somewhere last night that a lot of us were at. It's great to see you all. Thank you, obviously, to the sponsors, the NGC sponsors of Bocas, but also the British Council, who has sponsored this event. I've got a great panel assembled today to discuss the topic and the topicality of migration, ethnicity, and the possibilities for moving, thinking, and writing beyond boundaries. So I'll just quickly introduce the panel. They all deserve a much longer introduction, but if I was to do that, we'd just swallow up valuable time today. But please do look them all up. So Muli Amaye, who is a UK-born novelist and short story writer and poet, and she is currently working at St Augustine, coordinating the MFA Creative Writing Programme here in Trinidad. She has co-edited the Suitcase Book of Love Poems and an anthology called Migration Stories. Her debut novel, A House with No Angels, is published by Crocus Press almost imminently?
It's coming out very soon.
Very soon, okay. Afua Hirsc is a barrister, broadcaster, journalist and writer. She's worked for Sky News for a long time. She's particularly well known, I imagine, amongst this audience for her hard-hitting columns in The Guardian. And very, very recently, Jonathan Cape have published her book, Brit-ish, on race, identity and belonging. Thank you. Lovely to have you here too. Debbie Jacob is the author of a fictional memoir, Wishing for Wings, and her book, Making Waves, How the West Indies Shaped the United States, was published in 2017. Debbie is an educator. She teaches in prisons in Trinidad and Tobago and also at the International School in Port of Spain. Our last but no means least panelist is Anthony Joseph, who's a Trinidadian writer and musician. His publications include 3 volumes of poetry and 2 novels, both with wonderful titles, The African Origins of UFOs from 2006, and Kitch, which is really genuinely hot off the press. And he lectures in creative writing at Birkbeck College, London. So it's probably true to say there has never been a time when the topic of migration hasn't been topical. I recently read a piece in the Financial Times by the African writer Abdul Razak Gurna, who referred to Britain's centuries-long prevarication between sanctuary and xenophobia. Obviously, we are, perhaps even since this panel was conceived and configured, what's become very obvious is a very recent episode in that centuries-long history. And what's increasingly becoming obvious within that episode is a kind of long planning and implementation of a hostile policy against the children of the Windrush generation, which I think is kind of really caused huge outrage, obviously in the Caribbean and I think in Britain. These are the children of a generation of West Indian migrants who came to Britain not only because they were called upon for their labour, but they were called upon for their loyalty. And so that kind of whole question around entitlements, not only because of the contribution they made to Britain, but also because of their conception of the historical and emotional entanglements between the Caribbean and Britain that was often not reciprocated. Eleanor has just been talking very eloquently about how the peripheries always know more about the centre than the centre cares to know about the peripheries. So 2018 marks 70 years since the Windrush docked in Tilbury, and the Trinidadian Calypsonian Lord Kitchener walked down the gangplank and sang, "London is the place for me." It also marks 50 years, as you probably know, of Enoch Powell's chilling Rivers of Blood speech. And it seems to me that those narratives of inclusion and narratives of exclusion, the stakes around how to tell those stories, who tells them, and the power they have, it is really, really high at the moment. So before I move on to the works by these writers, I just wanted to give them all an opportunity to say something about how they think writers in this moment can respond. Muli, would you like to start?
This is unfair. Everything seems to be starting at this end. Okay, I think that as writers, we have a real responsibility right now to be recording what's happening, to be keeping a record, whether it's fictional. And somehow I like it to be fictional because books stay. People read books. And although we are fictionalizing the politics and people's lives and things that are happening, we know that it's going to be there, unlike landing cards that can be destroyed whenever it's chosen. So that's my take.
I am struck from writing the book that I had that just came out, Making Waves, How the West Indies Shaped the United States, about how little of our history that we often know. It surfaces somewhat when events happen, but to me, what I have seen is that you need a concept of what your history is, not what you were given by colonialism in order to navigate your way through this. I also just wanted to correct one little minor thing too. Wishing for Wings is not fictional in any way. It is totally nonfiction. So I just wanted to make that clear.
Oh, okay.
Hello? Yeah. I've always seen my role as a writer as a dismantler of systems. So whatever system I come upon, I kind of try to dismantle it in writing, to do something that's, original. And I think that the role of the writers has always been to do that, to sort of dismantle systems. And I think now the world that we live in is changing. Certain systems, patriarchy, certain gender issues are being dismantled. So I see myself as part of that process as a writer, someone who's dismantling systems of thought as well, So that's what I think.
Thank you. Afua?
Thank you. For me, one of the challenges at the moment is that a lot of the prejudice and racism and erasure that we face is quite subtle. It's quite coded. I think when you compare it to things maybe 50 years ago when everything seems to me and my generation more crude and overt. A lot of the narratives that perpetuate these myths and these prejudices, they often are more subtle and more buried. So for me as a writer, it's about how to be really creative in kind of drawing out the underlying truths to those codes or those subtle ways of kind of othering and alienating people and bringing them out into the open. And I think the fact that they're often covert means that you have to work that much harder to expose them. But for me as a writer, that's the challenge that I think it can be a really powerful one to try and rise to.
Okay, thank you. That's great, and it kind of sets up in many ways the kind of conversation that we can move into about the kind of nature and quality of the writings that we'll discuss in the panel. All of you have kind of migration in your lives, perhaps not directly, but a kind of history of migration that's informed how you think about yourselves, your world, your families. And all of you, it seems to me, reading your work, have come across some kind of boundary, and the work is, in a sense, a response to contest, to challenge that boundary. Afua, you speak in your book about the dominance of the question, where do you come from, and the way in which the question surfaces, as you just said, this kind of indelible question mark that hangs over British people of colour. And it just sort of hangs there. And I just felt that kind of sense of, the boundary of race, which you are trying to kind of draw attention to and say, theoretically, this panel's called Crossing Boundaries. Theoretically, we're all kind of invested in thinking how we can overcome those boundaries. But at the same time, what you argue really powerfully is we can't overcome them by just pretending that they're not there, or we don't see them, or we don't want them to be there. So we try, to magic them away. So I just wonder if you could talk about kind of the motivation for writing, but also kind of what it means for a boundary that you don't experience to be there.
Yes, it feels like history is coalescing around this moment in a really fascinating way, because this year in Britain we were getting ready to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the Windrush and mark the 50th anniversary of Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech. And if you look at Rivers of Blood, which is called Rivers of Blood, and it's known for Enoch Powell's kind of incendiary remarks about the banks of the Tiber foaming with blood because of the coloured influx. The thing that Enoch Powell was actually really worried about was not the number of immigrants coming from the Commonwealth. He was worried about their children. And he said the West Indian will never be English. His child will never be English. The Asian will never be English. His child will never be English. He will be a coloured or an Asian forever. And the reason that speech is traumatic for people of colour in Britain today is something the BBC doesn't seem to understand, because they decided to broadcast the speech thinking that was an interesting thing to do. The reason it's traumatic is because of this sense that this prophecy is coming true. Because people like me who were born in Britain, who are British, who are not immigrants, are still marked out and set apart. And whether it is through pretty unsubtle acts like trying to deport us, as we've seen lately, or whether it's through more covert things like constantly asking us where we're from when we're British. And we've always been British, and the expectation that we give an answer. And I say that because when you tell a British person who asks you where you're from that you're British, they say, yeah, but where are you really from? And they will keep on asking until they get the name of an African or Asian or Caribbean country. So for me, it's the kind of the ghost of Enoch Powell, the fact that this history has never been resolved, it's never really been addressed. The loss of empire looms large in the English imagination, but there's this kind of psychosis of denial that allows people to, at the same time, be proud of the empire but not understand why imperial subjects came to Britain. So for me, this is my lived experience, that because it has been more subtle in my lifetime, I've had to do the work to understand it and articulate it and name it, and then now as a writer to communicate it in a way that creates a safe space for conversation, which is really hard because there's the boundary you're pushing against of this kind of history that is quite toxic. But then there's also the response to you writing about it, which is more toxic. And, it's ironic for me because in my book I was saying that Britishness is an identity in crisis, that it's a very fragile identity. It cannot withstand critique at the moment. And the best case study for my argument has been the response to my book, which has been one of an incredible hostility. I mean, my book has been very well received, but there is a very strong hardcore of people, often very prominent people in the establishment, who have responded to my book by attacking me personally, not engaging with my arguments, but this instinct that if you don't like it here, you should just go back to where you came from. And it's a very powerful reminder that the things that I've identified that seemed quite subtle at the time, they don't seem that subtle anymore, actually.
I wonder if, just to give, because I recognise some people will have heard your one-to-one with Marina the other day, which was, wonderful, but some people may not have actually had a chance to hear your voice in the book, which is a much more personal voice in a way. And I wonder if you could just give us a taste of that before we move on.
Yes. Okay, well, the bit I chose is not actually that personal because it was a bit about migration, but would you like me to read a more personal bit of the book?
No, read this.
Okay, all right, I'll read the one I chose. So, and it's pretty relevant to the conversation we are having. By 1500, 6% of the population of London were immigrants. And when Queen Elizabeth I polled 7,000 foreigners in 1573, she found that a third or more had come only to seek work for their living, as in the modern and often deeply unflattering phrase, economic migrants. Tottenham, one Londoner complained during Henry VIII's reign, has turned French. As the slave trade commenced in Queen Elizabeth's day, thousands of Africans began to be brought to Britain, a population which had disappeared by the end of the Victorian era. They married. The only explanation for this disappearance is assimilation. They married and had children with white British people, with two consequences. The first is that generations of racial dilution mean that their descendants' black heritage is no longer visible. The second is that their genes remain spread far and wide in even the most seemingly ethnically undiverse of places. As well as being wrong, the idea that there were no immigrants in the nostalgic Britain of old is also irrelevant, because while it claims to be about foreigners coming to the UK, it's really about something else. The true purpose of modern claims about immigration is to create a scapegoat for society's deeper, more intractable problems. Jewish refugees fleeing the Nazis were interned not when they first arrived in Britain in the 1930s, but in the summer of 1940, as France and the Low Countries fell to the Nazis and the prospect of invasion became real. Civilization has shrunk, wrote Virginia Woolf on the eve of the war. Capturing the fears about the decline of the British Empire and the nation's sense of existential threat. In times of fear and suffering, people look for visible others to blame. So even though Enoch Powell was sacked from the cabinet after his infamous Rivers of Blood speech, his language was echoed by Margaret Thatcher in 1978, when she told Granada's television's World in Action that this country might be rather swamped by people with a different culture. And again by David Cameron in 2015, when he warned that Britain had to protect its borders amid the Syrian refugee crisis because you have got a swarm of people coming across the Mediterranean. But ideas of who is alien are constructed. It's just as easy to turn on people with a long history within a country as it is on those newly arriving. Post-revolutionary France, for example, had huge anxieties about the diversity of its population, only about half of which even spoke French, and the lowest of whom were still regarded by the mid-19th century as so miserable, inferior, and bastardized that they may be classed as below the most inferior savage races, for their inferiority is sometimes beyond cure. These interminable races were not African or Asian immigrants, but simply the French rural poor. Vilification of the working classes is something that the British establishment also perfected. The working class white population of East London, now often eulogized as a symbol of a long-lost past of strong communities and old-fashioned values, was not always so loved. The Bethnal Green poor, an 1864 article in a popular magazine said, are a caste apart, a race of whom we know nothing, whose lives are of quite different complexion from ours, persons with whom we have no point of contact.
Thank you. That's a great passage as well, because actually, in common with all of our other panellists, your book that speaks so powerfully and purposefully to the now mines history to say to us, even though very many of us have worked for decades and we kind of think that, you know, there is so much, or there should be, gosh, so much effort's been gone, how quickly things fall over that silence again, and that kind of dominant narrative comes over and obscures a kind of very rich history that you bring in the book forward and remind us about. Kitch, obviously, is a very personal, it's an act of recovery around one particular personal history, but that history spins out to say something about migration and identities in a particular way. And the form of the book very, very purposefully catches what it means to recover alive. So it's a beautiful narrative relay race where the story of Kitch's life comes from his friends, his rivals, his wife, newspaper cuttings, and I kind of deliberately didn't want to do the research to find out which bits were you and which bits were sort of genuine testimony, because it felt to me that the craft of those, the whole purpose of the book was to show how actually it's in the round that we get these different dimensions. So I wondered again if you could talk to us about that notion that he's not bounded by Trinidad, he's not bounded by, the call to the mother country, that there's your history of him releases him to us in a new way.
When I started writing this book, what I knew I didn't want to do was to do a standard sort of biography, sort of academic biography of Kitchener. I thought he deserved something slightly different. I didn't want to do, the biographies with the pictures in the middle and that sort of thing. I didn't want to do that because I wanted to sort of flatten the field. I didn't want it to be a focus on a great life like so much biographies are, which are invariably great white men lives. So I kind of tried to find a way of flattening it, which is a very, I guess, Lovelacean thing. Lovelace does that a lot in his novels. He flattens the field so that every character has an equal investment in the story and every character is important. So this is why the form takes on this sort of, it's testimony, and it's giving voice to people who haven't had a voice, like his wife, his wife Marge, various people that worked with him, colleagues, musicians that played with him. I wanted each of them to have a valid and important voice in the book. What emerges is, in a strange way, is almost a sort of a ghost of Kitchener that floats through the book, That's how I negotiated the idea of relaying a life that was actually created by not just Kitchener. I mean, we all created his life, So this is why the form is the way it is.
Okay, that's brilliant. Could you read for us as well to give us a sense of that, how that works?
Yeah. Well, actually, no. This section actually is one of the sections that's in third person. It's just standard sort of fictional third person. This is based on just one sentence that Kitchener says in a couple interviews. He says that when he first came to England, he was playing in a bar in Brixton, and somebody took the microphone off of his hand in the middle of his song and said, "Shut up! I don't understand a thing that you're saying." So I kind of, when I was writing that, it just wouldn't. My hand just wouldn't write it that way. I just had to have Kitch responding to it, So this is where the sort of blend of fiction and fact is blurred. So I'll just read an excerpt. A hand reaches up into the song to pull the microphone from the singer, Brady. He holds the chrome stand at an angle like a neck bent in supplication, and the lone loudspeaker squeals with feedback. Brady stands there for a moment, suspended, with his scowl and his stagger, as if he is waiting for the band, the singer, the barman, anybody to say something, to explain, to save themselves. But the tune is broken, the wood bass gone fickle, the drummer hand stick, the piano weeping in a ditch of knives, and the singer does not sing. The audience start to rumble and guff, but no one steps to Brady in that gap of time. "You call this music?" Brady asks in seriousness. "I've not understood a single thing, not a single word. It's nonsense what you're singing there. What is it? It's complete nonsense. That's what it is." Kitchener's mouth opens but makes no sound. His eyes bulge and stare. One cool bead of sweat rolls down the side of his face with his arms slung down. Act or be impacted upon. Do or be done to. Take front before front take you. Conrad stands beside Kitchener at the front of the stage. "Come on, man," he calls to Brady. "Give him back the microphone. No one trouble you. What you want in this?" But his pleading eyes do not assuage Brady, who holds fast to the mic stand. "I said play the jazz, lad. That's what you boys could play. And you, mate, you can't sing. Get yourself off. A string of bunting tangles in Kitchener's shoe as he jumps down from the stage. It rips, pulling a string of small Irish flags pinched from their thumbtacks. A heat begins to build in him, a rage so nervously hesitant, vexation collapsing upon himself. He pulls at the microphone stand, still gripped in Brady's hand. His voice is awkward and tremulous, pushing against the plot. Give me that, man. You mad or what? Give me the damn thing. Brady's grip is feeble. The pull shocks him to stumbling. Then he bucks back and raises his hands, palms up, as if in a question. There is a pained and bitter grin in the corner of his mouth, but his moment is past. He drifts to the far end of the bar, knocks his shin bone on a bar stool, and calls for a double scotch and fades. The band kick back. Plot is how you tell it. The trumpeter pierces the air with the cry of his horn. The rhythm jumps, and Kitchener sings. Sing it now, sing it away like everything else. Let it go. Humble down deep in the song. True. Oh Lord, Kitchener, I want to go. Let me go. Take me back to Trinidad.
Thank you. And really, I'm sure that Kitch is also sold out at the bookstore, but if it's not, it really is a kind of incredibly moving. I mean, even though you move around all of these different lives, I mean, the emotional force of the book, I think, is quite incredible. And you did mention there, which I think is really significant, that you also explore what it was like for Margie, Kitchener's wife, who was born to an Irish family, who actually, had no issue around her marrying Kitch. But when she came to Trinidad, belonging was not effortless for her. I wonder if that's just a kind of interesting dimension of the other migration story in the book.
Yeah, I mean, Marge was an interesting character. I mean, she told me some stories about coming to Trinidad, which were fascinating to me, which I didn't know about, which was a kind of reverse kind of racism that was going on towards her, in that she was saying that she would try to stop taxis and no one would stop for her as a white woman. I was like, really? She was there. She was like, I could stand up on the street, on the side of the road, and no taxis would stop for me. She would go to a party, for instance. I think there's a scene in the book where she goes to a party in Trinidad with Kitch. Kitch didn't like to take her out. I don't know why. I don't know. He didn't want to be seen with her too much in public. He kept her at home. But when they did go out, there was one party they went to, and she was saying to me that the black women at the party wouldn't speak to her. The black men would, the guys would, but the women just wouldn't speak to her. And even the white women there, what they were concerned about was her social status, where she was from, or what her class was. They were not, and they were like, what are you doing here? So yeah, she had an interesting experience, and I think that scarred her, and I think it affected her deeply. Also, the fact that Kitchener was running around doing his thing and would leave her at home. And do various things, which are all in the book.
Yeah.
All the bacchanal.
Yeah, but it's really important, that kind of counterbalance, because the kind of story of masculinity in that book is also a kind of identity in crisis as well. It's that kind of precarious, something that asserts itself so strongly, in a sense, because it knows, the assertion is the only thing it has left.
Yeah.
Debbie, your book, the boundary that you kind of pushing against is that, I think that the ignorance about the history of the West Indies, and not just a kind of sense that people don't know enough about their history, which I think kind of, is keenly felt anyway, but also that there's this cultural flow always from the global South to have to acknowledge the history of the global North. And you really try and brush against that grain very strongly in the book to show how influential Caribbean figures have been in shaping the United States. You just tell us a little bit more about that kind of motivation, and also read for us?
Okay. Yes, I actually started this book when I was teaching CXC Caribbean history at YTC, which is the detention place for boys who commit crimes. And I was totally incensed. I mean, I was so angry that 10% of the syllabus has to do with the United States' influence on the Caribbean. And the rest of the book is basically American Indians, colonial things, slavery, the conversations we always have, and nothing about how the West Indies influenced anything out there. I was doing an interview with the singer Aaron Neville, and we were talking about the wild Chapatulas and how much the Mardi Gras Indians resemble our Carnival Indians, and how much the music of the wild Chapatulas resembles Carnival. And he said, oh yes, my brothers used to say that New Orleans is really just a Caribbean island that collided with the States. And all this kind of came together, and I decided to look into this, and I was so fascinated. You know, we can go back to the Dutch West Indies influence on New Amsterdam, which became New York, right down to the present. And the stories are just like, they were just mind-boggling to me. Like, why don't we know these stories? There are two major cities in the United States that were founded by West Indians. One of them I learned about in the Hilton Pool from a friend of mine who was used to work for the ILO of the United Nations. She said, oh, you have Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable in your book, right? And I said, no. Anybody knows who that is? He founded Chicago. He was a Haitian who founded Chicago. And I said, oh, that didn't make the white history books. We started like 20 years later when the French-Canadian LaSalle came down, you know, and everything is so there in the records. He was a trader and he kept impeccable records. So we know everything that was in his house, everything he traded, everything. Not in the history books. It became well known when Haitian physicians in Chicago started a movement to have him recognized. San Francisco was founded by somebody from the Danish West Indies. And all these stories, you know, just kept pouring out. While I was writing it, the musical Hamilton became very popular. Before the musical became popular, the government had decided they were going to take Hamilton off the $10 bill, or at least make him share it with a woman. And after the musical became so popular, they decided they're going to throw off Andrew Jackson instead, and Hamilton gets to keep his place in the on the $10 bill. So all these stories I just kept finding. I'm going to just read you the introduction. Well, not the introduction. I'm going to read you one paragraph. I think I pretty well summed up the whole book in the first, or what I wanted to accomplish with the book in the first. I think I pretty much summed up what I want to accomplish in the book in the first 5 words. Of the introduction, which I wrote at the end of the book, because Judy Raymond, who edited the book for me, reminded me that I needed an introduction. Okay, so this is it. When he mounted a donkey and rode away from Granada, Christopher Columbus was sure his dream of exploring uncharted seas had finally come to an end. He had no idea that he would find support from an unexpected source in Queen Isabella's court, or that together he and the Queen would be thrust into history for fashioning a myth that would wrongly define the Caribbean islands. And then the whole book really deals with those colonial myths that started and how we lost these stories of our history. I had loved the idea when I found that description of Columbus riding away in defeat from Granada on a donkey. because the only image we ever have is this glorious image of Columbus coming on a ship to the New World to wreak all this havoc. And I thought, that is what I wanted to do, give different images of our history.
That's brilliant, thank you. I'm also Your last comment there triggers me to Jamaica Kincaid's Annie John, for the Columbus in Chains episode, where she, which is a wonderful episode. But I think, you know, that notion, you've written the book in such a way that it's also accessible, I think, you know, for young people as well as adults. And in many senses, every chapter of your book needs at least another book. I mean, there's so much in there, so many lives. And as you say, those historical resources are accessible, but the erasure of them from kind of a legitimated version of the historical is really astonishing. So I think, it's kind of for all of us who are educators to build on that and to actually do more work to recover in kind of thicker and then beautifully creative ways to actually bring that, to not enable in 10 years' time to have another panel here where people say, you know who so-and-so is, and everyone says over again, no. Muli, coming to your work, I know yours is set, your novel is set in Manchester in 1945. I'm sure that place and time is already chiming with people in the audience as the moment of the fifth Pan-African Congress, which was a really significant moment, obviously, again, for trying to purposefully shift historical sensibilities to say, we have an opportunity to think about solidarities and sensibilities that are formed by an alliance and an understanding of a shared African heritage and future, very much with a reckoning of the future. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about why that time and place, and then also read from your work.
Well, my novel starts in 1945. I have 3 women narrating the stories. And what I wanted to do, the boundaries that I was looking at were politics and the fact that women were excluded. In 1945, when I started my research, I was finding photographs in the archives of this Pan-African conference that took place in October in 1945. And it was all of the leaders of the day, the African, the Caribbean, the Indian leaders, and they were having their photographs taken with white women, which is not a problem, but where were the African women? And my research had turned up that there were African women there, and there were whole communities who were working together to better lives and to do things. And I wanted to then look at why the women were excluded, not only from the politics, but from telling their own stories. So I very purposefully created characters. We have Addie, who always goes back to 1945. She wants to tell us the story of the conference from her perspective. And then we have her daughter, who is mixed race, nothing to do with me, who tells her story of the 70s. And that was the Black Power movement. And her partner, who she thinks is very secret, is called Dia. And Dia is a very dark black woman. And Elizabeth is mixed race. So in some ways, she was trying to find her way from having no identity, from not understanding who she was. She has this Nigerian mother. She has an Englishman as a father who lives in Nigeria, and her mother lives in Manchester. So she's really not fitting anywhere. And so she's kind of looking for where she can place her politics and where she can place herself. And then I moved on to her daughter, Coots, who's named after Mrs. Ransom Cootie. Go look her up. She's really interesting. Fela Cootie's mother. And the politics that she was getting involved with, that she felt was nothing to do with her grandmother or her mother, but these were the real politics of the day, but they didn't call them politics. It was just, this is what we do. So I was kind of exploring the way women deal with politics in very ordinary life. The big stories miss them out. So what are these meta-narratives going to tell us?
All right, that's great. Thank you. You're going to read a little for us?
I'm going to read just a very small section from each of them, just to display how they were looking at or how they were dealing with what was going on and where they were being excluded. So we'll start with Addie. It was too strange. Everywhere I looked, I saw white faces, and I felt like a foreigner. When I was at home, I never once questioned who or what I was. I was simply Addie. My mama and papa were who they were, and Peter was white. He was the foreigner. Of course, I did not think about that at the time when he came to our compound I did not think about speaking to him to find out who he was until he came visiting. And then I'll move on to Elizabeth. And I just thought that this was an important section because it talks about being excluded from the politics of the time, from certain politics. Okay. So anyway, Dia was next to me, and I heard her suck her teeth right next to my ear. It penetrated my reverie, and she was kind of nudging me. When I glanced at her, she was nodding her head towards the front of the room, and a kind of, will you look at that? And she was pulling her face, so I started listening. The pasty guy who was talking was going on about some Aryan race shit, and the meeting wasn't even about that, obviously, it was communism, or we wouldn't have been there. A sudden crackle of tension around where we were standing made us tense up. A room of about 150 people with 6 or 7 black faces. I don't know what made me do it, but I shouted something like, "Sorry, comrade, I don't understand you. Could you speak in English, please?" And Dia cracked up next to me, and some guy across the room shouted, "Say it, sister." And Yemi turned round and looked into my eyes. His eyes were laughing, and I could feel the laugh right down inside of me, and I swear, if it was possible, I would have been pregnant right there and then. And then I'll move on to Coots, who speaks a kind of Manchester patois, I'm going to call it. But it's very much, no matter how educated some of the teenagers are in the UK, they like to kind of drop it down a tone. So it tells me Auntie Dia what Wahida's being sent back, and it's like I'm sat in the bloody citizens' advice, because my mum and my nan are like chipping in and giving advice and stuff. And it ain't like it's their job, like my Auntie Dia deals with this, innit, because she's a social worker with kids. And I know Wahida ain't really a kid, but that's how we're classed, because we ain't 18 yet. So my nan's like, yeah, it was like this back in the day when I arrived and they didn't want us, and I'm like, us who, yeah? Because I'm born and bred. But she's going on about colonialism and shit, which is like slavery days, innit? And then she says, we need to do meetings and shit. And like, what does she think we've been doing? And it's like my job to find out stuff from my Auntie Dia, duh. Then my mum's going on about black power and stuff, and how her and my Auntie Dia starts reminiscing about Angela Davey or someone and wearing black berets like French dudes and telling me we need to do protests and rallies, whatever they are. And it's like they think we don't know nothing. Didn't hear my mum saying protest when we did a proper big protest about Iraq war, innit? Fact, I can only remember her going on about being arrested and missing exams and trouble starting. Finally, my Auntie Dia texts me serious and tells me about some organisations and stuff that we can do, because at college we're going to do a proper protest. And we're putting on a dance, and there's bands and stuff, and someone's getting in touch with the Metro paper, because it ain't right. She didn't ask to come here, she was sent, and it ain't fair that after all this time, they should try and send her back. It's out of order.
Thank you. I think what your work really beautifully displays there for us, but actually what informs all of your writings is this idea really of a kind of releasing lots of voices. So what academically I'm trained to call the polyvocality of history. And that's really important because it's a really importantly pluralizing perspective. And it's a kind of, Anthony, you spoke at the beginning about wanting to kind of challenge how things are done. And in a way, it's a kind of decolonizing impulse to say, there isn't this one voice, there isn't this one story. The academic in me is just going to surface very briefly now, because I think there is a Trinidadian who links all of your work, who is the exceptional George Padmore, who actually obviously had a role in establishing the Pan-African Federation in 1944 and then in organising that 5th Congress. And also, Anthony, you mentioned Kitchener's Calypso, the birth of Ghana, that connects Trinidad to Ghana. And obviously, Padmore was very much that connection personified. He was appointed by Kwame Nkrumah as the chief advisor on African affairs after Ghana's independence. And Debbie, your interest really in thinking about West Indians who've influenced America, because Padmore went to Howard University, studied law, became a communist there, actually became Padmore in the States. And then his work on the Negro Worker newspaper, edited from Moscow, but became really influential in kind of reshaping that idea of communism to take account of and for blackness and race politics. So I just thought it's really interesting that there is actually, connections between all of these works. And perhaps it's not surprising it's a Trinidadian who makes the connection because of the intensity of cultural encounter and exchange that has kind of informed Trinidad's history, and the mobility and fluidity of Trinidadians historically. I'm very aware lots of people in the audience want to ask questions, so this is going to be kind of my last throw out to the panel. But obviously we're here in Trinidad, and the national motto here is together we aspire, together we achieve. And lots of Caribbean nations are distinguished by a kind of upfront narrative of inclusion out of many, one people out of many. Even if that, we all know the inside of that is kind of flawed or compromised. It's a kind of statement of recognizing plurality, multiplicity as strength, as, reality. And it seems obvious that, the wrongs of the current moment around migration, something we really need to think about and to tackle. We know not just the kind of enduring violence of colonialism, but the slow violence of climate change is going to mean that more and more people are going to move from the place that they were from. And we need to find a way of living together and meaningfully. And I guess, for me, the Caribbean's history has modeled a lot of those possibilities, moments of social crisis, violence, exclusion, but also perhaps, centuries of actually living in proximity and learning to live together. And I just wondered, for all of you looking at that future, what would, if there are kind of, this is probably lots of young people tuning in today, in terms of thinking about that project of living together, how do you think we're going to manage through the arts or through writing or broadcasting to tackle that?
Well, I am really interested to hear Muli's work because I have been looking more and more at Pan-Africanism and 1945 and Padmore and Nkrumah and Kenyatta and Zikiwe. And, for me, as someone who lives in London, I'm so fascinated by the fact that Pan-Africanism kind of evolved in London during the war when these black men and women, and it's so interesting about the erasure of women from the Pan-African movement as well, that I think I grew up with a narrative that it was a doomed project, that Pan-Africanism was kind of an interesting idea that ultimately was doomed to fail, and that the people behind it kind of fell into despotism or they were assassinated or both. And I think this is something that as a writer you can do, is to kind of look at these ideologies. I mean, it was the most powerful ideology. It changed the world. It shaped the 20th century. It totally reconfigured the geopolitical landscape of our reality. And it was something that these African and Caribbean men and women created. It's such a powerful thing. How have we become so detached from it? And I'm really interested in looking back and seeing what we can revive from the work that was done before by these incredible thinkers and innovators and build a future. And, the one thing that everyone can remember about Pan-Africanism is the idea that there is no future for black people without the rising of the African continent. And I think that is, it's a really simple and powerful idea. And it's ideologically very rich. And, the role that communism played is really contested, and whether they were really communists is really complicated. They were trying to distance themselves from Western capitalism, and it wasn't communism as many Marxists would recognize it. But I think as a writer, it is really important to look back and see what we've forgotten and why, and how it's relevant to today, and how it can provide a blueprint from the future. So, for me, that's like a really concrete area to mine and take inspiration from.
Brilliant, thank you. Anthony?
I think it's a big question. I mean, how do we move forward? I don't know. I think what I was talking about earlier is about the sort of blurring of boundaries, More and more boundaries are being blurred or erased, or eroded in some way. And I think that will continue, but I think there's going to be resistance to that. So I'm not that hopeful, I got to say, because I've been reading C.L.R. James, again, Black Jacobins, and this is writing in the 1930s and saying stuff like, these things are permanent situations, certain sort of the way things are stacked against African and Caribbean people is like a permanent condition, and those in power, I think Fanon talks about it as well, that the people that have power are not going to relinquish that power. And we're dealing with people who have tremendous economic power, and they are the ones that we're facing in order to make change. And that is going to be, it's going to be difficult to force that change. You're talking about the Enoch Powell speech. I mean, the fact that the BBC found it a good idea to replay this speech in 2018 in the 70th year anniversary of that says something about what we're against. So it makes me less hopeful because I think it's going to be a struggle. And I think Linton talks about it as LKJ in a recent Guardian interview, that these things are not going to be easy to change. So we can be hopeful, we can be, in theory, and we can have ideas of how we're going to move forward as writers and stuff. But we're dealing with a capitalist structure. We're dealing with late capitalism, which is clinging to power. And it's going to be a struggle.
Yeah, I guess projecting right forward to think, I'm perhaps kind of overly inspired by watching the Black Panther movie, thinking maybe when Europeans are economic migrants in Africa in 100 years' time. It's an interesting thought to think how, the shift of resources or whatever, the possibilities that we perhaps don't, because you're right, we're so saturated in the kind of the way in which capital has been extracted from certain histories and the attachment to retaining the power structures of that. But what I think, in a sense, what was so kind of captivating about that movie was the sense of, what if the resources were redistributed outside of that historical paradigm, which is not to...
That's exactly what they were saying in 1945.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, it's not a new idea.
Yeah.
And to me, it's so interesting that has been kind of received as new, because so many people have forgotten or, are so distant from the thinking and the visionaries that have already been before. So, if it takes a Disney Marvel movie to reconnect you with them, then great.
Yeah.
But for me also, there is this kind of sadness that the distance that's emerged in the meantime.
Yeah, but
I'd just like to say quickly as well that the West have been economic migrants, and
Yes.
they went all over the world and they took everybody's resources. So if it does come again, it's just a repetition, but maybe on the other side of things. It's not something that they haven't done before. It's not something that they don't continue to do.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be anything new. But I think that we should have hope. I do think that we should have hope. And the reason I say that is because, Coots in here is based on young people that I've spoken to. And my son growing up, and all of his friends were white in a very nice area, Chorlton. He went to the school there, and he just kept telling me to shut up. I don't want to know about your politics. You're always going on about black this, blah, blah, blah. And he was going on. And it took him traveling. I think he was in Sri Lanka, and he sat down with some white Americans, I think, and these people sat there and they started talking about the local people and really, really being racist about them. And all of a sudden it was just like, bang, everything clicked in my son's head, and he laid it on them. I'm so proud of him. And it took that to wake him up. And because our young people think that, no, so Coots in here, she says, us who? Yeah, because I'm Black British, like I'm born and bred. And the young people were starting to think that they were just really, really comfortable, that they were there, that this was their home. And then they're starting to wake up. Because the sus law and all the things that were happening to the young black youth, it wasn't happening to them because they were going to school and they were keeping their head down. The people from the Windrush, they came, they kept their head down. They did their little jobs. They got their children through education. They have doctors and lawyers and whatever in the family. They kept their head down. Has it saved them? No. But there is hope because our young people are waking up.
Debbie, thank you for that, Muli. Debbie?
Well, I want to think there's hope also, and I think that one of the things that encourages me the most is the type of nonfiction, particularly biography and history, that I'm seeing coming out of these states right now. We're looking at events and dissecting them in a different way than we used to, and looking at different angles to the same stories that we've been telling all the time. And I really believe that you can't be rooted in now without having a sense of your history. That's what empowers you, and that is what has given the colonial masters and the neo-colonialists the power that they have, as the narratives that they've written for themselves. Yeah. And we have to claim those. I would say briefly that this book ends with a very famous, just not a whole chapter, just kind of something to entice for the future, because I'm working on that book now, about a very famous civil rights leader in Nashville, Zephaniah Alexander Luby, who was from Antigua. And nobody knows about him. He's very famous in Nashville. Yeah. And the reason people don't know about him is because during the civil rights movement, and he was doing cases from like the 1940s, everybody was just going through the motions of doing the trials so they would get to the Supreme Court so that the everything could be settled in the Supreme Court. He was winning cases on the ground level. Those kinds of stories are the types of stories that are coming out now, just like what you were saying, the people who kept their heads down and did things in the fashion that was expected of them. Nashville was ahead of the South in a lot of ways during the civil rights movement because of him, and Thurgood Marshall, who did cases with him too. So I'm very hopeful, also because I see young people, and in prison, the books of choice are nonfiction, history, and biography. My daughter, Ejania, actually did a study, and that is what the disenfranchised in prison want to read. So people are becoming more interested in their history, and I think that shows great hope.
Thank you. I mean, I guess one of the interesting things that this panel shows is, in a sense, the literary is another form of the historical, or another engagement with the historical. And, you've all spoken about how both the really well-known histories have somehow been erased, how within those well-known histories there were women's histories that were never kind of were erased as they were unfolding. And then also these kinds of, individuals who had these exceptional lives. Mm-hmm. So for all of you who are tuning in or here, who are thinking, what would I write about next? There is a lot of work still to be done, and there's an amazing, amazing history to bring, whether you're a fiction or a non-fiction writer. Thank you so, so much for your contributions. I'm going to turn now to the audience for questions. Yes, Annalie?
Yeah, I wanted to ask Afua, we started to talk a little bit a couple of days ago, because I see sometimes there's what feels like an existential crisis for people like yourself in these metropolitan cities as biracial people that are trying to find a space to belong. And I've noticed through seeing a lot of Black, British, Canadian, and American artists coming through our residency program in Barbados are trying to come out and feel this sense of belonging. And I was wondering if you would be willing to share some of that, because I know you speak in the book a little bit about that, what it's like going to Africa and feeling as though you can belong, and how that continues to upend your sense of belonging in the UK again. Because I feel that's something that this generation, your generation, are kind of experiencing all over these global north metropolitan cities.
Yes, thank you very much. That's such a good question, and complicated. So for me, my mother is Ghanaian, my father is white British with Jewish German heritage. I grew up in a very white part of London, so I was always the black girl. And I was resolved at quite a young age that the solution to my identity crisis would be to go to Ghana, because I'm the black girl, so obviously when I go to Ghana, I'll fit in. And of course, the first time I go to Ghana, the first thing everyone says is white girl. And, that set off a kind of longer crisis for me, and this realization. And actually, it's funny to be here and people saying I look Trini, because this is the only part of the world, I feel, where I actually look like I could be from here. And I'm not from here, but it's really unusual experience to feel like I just can kind of blend in, and I've never had it before anywhere else. I can kind of, in Morocco, if I don't speak, I can kind of pull it off. So I think that is a growing problem because Britain has the highest rate of interracial relationships in the Western world. And people are very keen to say that that makes us post-racial. It's evidence that we solved the problem. It doesn't. It just vastly increases the number of people affected by the problem. And that's why I wrote my book, really, because I've spent my whole life trying to understand. And I think for me as well, as somebody who's half black and half white, there is a specific experience of being born into two identities that were created to be oppositional. Because, blackness would not exist without whiteness, and neither of these racial constructs would exist without the need to create pseudo-scientific racism for the purposes of slavery and colonialism. So as a child born into these identities that are constructed in opposition, it's very difficult to understand why your two halves are kind of set to be opposed. And it's not something anyone tells you because it's a very taboo subject. The history is not accessible. No one talks about it. Britain is a country where race is avoided at all costs. People will tiptoe around it as much as they can. And so that's been my life's work. And so for me personally, it's been a process of, I've lived in Africa I've lived in Senegal, I've lived in Ghana twice, I've traveled a lot around Africa. I'm beginning to spend more time in the Caribbean. And for me, it's kind of understanding my political blackness, my ideology, my purpose. And I think when you work on your sense of purpose, needing a place where you can blend in becomes less important. But I think it's important to acknowledge the confusion that comes with having these multiple identities and the need to find a way to resolve them. But for me, I've learned that it's not a place. There is no place that can solve the problem.
Thank you. David? Oh.
Thank you. Thank you for such an extraordinarily rich discussion. I wanted to go back to, I guess, a point. I want to call it an intervention that Afua made right at the beginning, which is, I guess, to place a new emphasis, I think new is in quotation marks, but a new emphasis on the second generation of visible minority, quote-unquote, immigrants, and using that as a locus from which to address this age-old question of the politics of race and belonging. And I new in quotation marks because there's this rich tradition in Black British thought, beginning for me with C.L.R. James, but Stuart Hall, and now of course you, doing precisely that. So how does the politics of race and belonging look not to that first generation that comes, but that second generation that perhaps has been told a narrative, as Marie says, keep your head down, do the right things, learn to speak the way you ought to, adopt the cultural mores, and you will belong. And the second generation realizing, no, I won't belong. I'm still not Canadian, UK, or America. And my question really is not so much, how does that generation then speak back to Britain, Canada, the US, but I think the more intimate question what kind of conversation does that second generation have with the first generation? And so that particular kind of conversation, which is so crucial, that intergenerational conversation for understanding a legacy, and at the same time, there is tension between two different visions of what it is to belong.
Thank you very much. I feel like I'm hogging the Q&A. Maybe someone else wants to say something as well. There are two things basically that I would say, and yeah, it's a great question. And it's a really important area. I certainly experience it within my own family. So the two things that I would say are two kind of companion concepts of gratitude and white approval. And for the first generation, I think that and I get it within my own family, this concept of gratitude was a real and maybe more practical than emotional necessity. This idea, we've come here, we need to just get along. There are all of these very real physical and financial obstacles to us being able to establish ourselves. And one of the ways that we get along also is by seeking white approval. Don't do anything to upset people. Don't draw attention to yourself. Just get on with it. And this is where I have hope and optimism as well. I think my generation and younger generations, we're British. We didn't come to Britain. We didn't ask to be British. And we're still expected to be grateful. And, the other day, the Daily Mail published a double-page spread asking why I'm not more grateful. Literally, it was a gift in making my point. So I think, this concept of gratitude is something that we have no tolerance for. Why should we be more grateful? No white British person is ever asked to be grateful. And this concept of white approval, I was very much conditioned that I should behave in a way that doesn't subvert or disrupt the existing order, the existing cultural and kind of power structure. And that's something that also we have less tolerance for, because we were born here, this is our identity. Why shouldn't we express it? Why should we seek to assimilate, disappear into the pre-existing culture? So I see a huge change. It can be quite difficult to communicate that to the first generation who still have that instinct. And my grandmother, I was saying yesterday, she's saying, Afua, stop talking so much and stop upsetting the white people, And I get it. I totally get it. But I think that's the change. And that's where we have evolved, but the society around us hasn't evolved and still expects us to behave as if we came here asking for something and should be grateful that we received it.
I think that's a very interesting question because, I grapple with something similar to that every day when I look at the internet and see how far civil rights seem to be eroding in the States. And just the other day, I saw a quote buried somewhere that Coretta Scott King had said when she was asked about civil rights, and she said, that is something that every generation has to reclaim. And I think that we think a lot like, okay, it's done, it's over, we move on, and it is a reoccurring battle all the time.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that within my novel, I very purposefully, I have the colonial voice in Ade, I have the post-colonial voice with Elizabeth, and then I have the Black British voice. And to me, that was really important. I can remember sitting with my father, who was Nigerian, and he praised the British. They were so amazing, they know everything, they do everything, and I would be sitting there going, what are you talking about? Like, do you really think that they wanted you here? Because my dad was there until 63 or so, and he went back to Nigeria. And when he came to visit me, he was like, this is so amazing, look what the British have done, and it's fantastic. And I was saying, yeah, see that building there? That was built on slavery money, Dad. So we have those kinds of conversations. And then, as I say, the younger generation, again, my son is just going, oh, shut up. Just shut up. But the conversations do still have to keep coming around. It's not something that we can leave. You can't leave it to lie. And you have to challenge each other. You have to challenge each other.
Can I, just to make a point about that, there's an essay by Carol Phillips in which he talks about a concept called nervous hesitancy, which was a characteristic for him of the first generation that came. So he talks about him and his father having dinner in a restaurant. His father was the first generation, came in the late 40s, early 50s. And Carol, of course, was born in the UK. So they're having dinner, and they order steak, and something is wrong with the steak, I think. His father doesn't like how the steak is cooked. So Carol is saying to him, oh, just get the waiter to bring another one. And the father's response is, no, I don't want to, cause any trouble. There's this sense of nervous hesitancy that was a characteristic of that first generation. When you talk about approval and wanting to not disrupt, wanting to please, wanting to fit in. And I think we found out in my grandparents, by the time I left here, they were still saying things like, oh, when you go in England, you have to learn to talk properly, you have to do this, you have to dress, So there's this whole thing. And I think Carol's generation was the generation which said, call the damn guy, let him bring another steak, you know what I mean? And I think that sort of dialogue, that space is interesting. How these people, how Carol and his father talk to each other, and how Carol influences his father and said, you know, you can do this, you know? I think that's an interesting space. I think that's what we're talking about.
Thank you. Carolyn? Is the mic down here?
Thank you. Just a little correction. Carol was actually born in the Caribbean. He went as a baby in arms. Talking about the erasure of the black female, I just have to make this very important point. Bocas gives a Henry Swansea Prize for his role in the Caribbean Voices program. The program was actually started by Una Marson. She created the program. When she left the UK, Swansea took it over. So I would love to see Bocas rename the prize as a Marson Swansea Prize, because black women keep on getting erased from the narrative. She was a poet, she wrote plays, she was a broadcaster, a very important voice. And it's not because she's Jamaican why I'm trying to recuperate her. No, this has been such an excellent panel that I feel very ungrateful to make this other point that the panel is sponsored by the British Council. And I'm wondering if we shouldn't interrogate the role of the British Council as another version of a colonial enterprise that is intended to rehabilitate the empire, but in a much more urbane, non-threatening way. So that's just a question I'm throwing out that, you know, for us to consider.
That's an interesting one. I mean, it's interesting, I guess. I mean, what they expect from that sponsorship, what kind of, I mean, the British Council, I remember, sponsored Linton when he published England is a Bitch, and I thought it was just such a perfect thing that the British Council sponsored him to go around and read from England.
It's another one of those interesting one-way relationships, because no one in Britain has really heard of the British Council. If you go anywhere in the former empire, you know, if you go to Ghana, the main cultural hubs in Accra, the British Council, the Alliance Française, and the Goethe Institute, you know, which no one in Europe would ever have even heard of. It's so interesting how they remain these really important cultural figures in former colonies. I mean, I'm all about challenging these colonial legacies, you know, the Commonwealth, the British Council, all of them. And I think that, you know, it's this always the same paradigm that they do good, but what was the underlying, and what is the underlying motive? And I think you're absolutely right. We shouldn't be afraid to interrogate any of these things.
Yeah, I was having this discussion recently with a friend of mine, and I was basically saying the same thing, that in no way could I feel comfortable about supporting anything that is built on the enslavement of my people, you know. But I live in London, you know. So it's that sort of, I see myself as in a liminal space, and I have to find a way of being both British and Trinidadian at the same time and occupy that space and take the good from one and the bad from, you know, and work with that, you know. I don't think you could completely negate a whole system. You know, you can't negate it and say it's terrible. You have to, you know, work with it. You know, find a way to subvert it even, but work with it. You know.
I found that I was working with the British Council in Kurdistan for quite a few things, and I found that I expected one thing and I received another. In that it was the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare, so they put on a Shakespeare. I'd never been to Shakespeare. I went to Shakespeare in Erbil in Kurdistan. Random, really, really random. But they have many programs that at first I was thinking, oh, white savior, you know, they're here and they're doing for people, and yet they do owe back. But actually, the people that I dealt with were very open to learning, and very open to allowing the people in these former colonies to have their voice and to do as they needed to do. So I think that there is some change. The British Council, maybe it should change its name, maybe, because it has some, well, no, because it does have some negative connotations, but it isn't necessarily a negative program, and it really helps in a lot of places that it is. And I'm not an advocate for it. Okay.
Thank you. I think we've probably got time for one more question, or maybe two over there.
Hi. Thank you all. There's really powerful and beautiful words. One word that Debbie said, though, it was our. When she was talking about carnival, she said, our carnival Indians. Now, Debbie's been here a long time. I've only been in Trinidad 5 years. I've started writing our, we, us in my newspaper columns, and my wife, who's Trinidadian, says, can you do that? Are you allowed to do that? And she says John Oliver does that in the US. And I think, you know, I feel part of Trinidad society. I have a sense of belonging here in that very short space of time to be able to say that. Obviously, you can hear that I'm from England. I feel very English. Me and Afua have a very similar background, but kind of different, you know, experiences of it. We've mentioned Enoch Powell on the panel today. There was another Tory politician of the time, Norman Tebbit, who devised the Tebbit test, that if you support England at cricket rather than the country of your parents, like India or the West Indies, then that's what counts. I always supported England growing up. When they played the West Indies, it kind of, I didn't really mind if England lost, and in fact I started to feel sorry for the English batsman. It was more what happened. But I think these things are about kind of confidence in your belonging and your identity. The Windrush generation, as you say, kept their heads down. People, as soon as they arrived, told them, you know, you're not really British. That didn't really stop a lot of that older generation feeling British. And I've seen confidence in kind of second and third generation Muslims in London right now, in contemporary London, a real confidence in the fact that they are British and they're Muslim. They wear the headscarf. No one's going to tell them they're not British. So there are... I'm trying to come to my question, but it's... whenever you talk about migration and write about migration, there's always quite a lot of sadness and anger are the emotions that prevail. But there is a lot of positive stories in migration. I'm sure all of you, stories of migration have been quite positive. And I guess, Muli, you had a lot of humour from the things that you read. There was a lot of humour in your writing. And I'm just kind of wondering, is it important, how do we inject that positivity so that future generations do feel that sense of belonging and identity rather than feeling they have to kick against a system that doesn't, you know, include them?
The humour hides the tears, trust me. Because we laugh when we can't cry or when we can't shout and when we can't scream, so we laugh. And I think that each generation has got to fight for its identity. I don't think it's going to be something that's going to come easy. If you have brown skin, you are going to fight. If you're in the UK or if you're in the US, you're going to fight for your identity. My social identity is white working class. That's how I was socialized, but I didn't fit. When I went to Nigeria, my family there were kind of upper class. I didn't fit because I had a white working class background, and then I was a white wife when I was there, just as you had as well. So identity is something that you have to find within yourself. You have to find it within yourself. And I think that's the way that we're going to have to talk to our future generations, to have them finding who they are and where they want to sit and where they want to be and who they want to be.
I find so too. I find that, you know, so many of us are fluidly crossing boundaries all the time. And I think this book helped me tremendously to understand my place as someone who's now lived in Trinidad more than half my life. And yet sometimes, you know, when I go to Nashville a lot to do research, and I love the place, and I love how it packages its history, but I'm very aware of that history, both in the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement, how awful it is. But see a way to use that to try to move forward with identities in places that have had awful histories. So it's an interesting thing, I think, to look at is how we negotiate ourselves and our own cultural boundaries that we have to navigate all the time, and how we reflect that in what we write.
I have a really curious relationship to Britain in terms of my identity, because I left here when I was like early 20s, 21 or so. And actually in the time I've spent in the UK, I've become more of a Trini. You know, the longer I stay there, the more Trini I become, because I hold on to that center, you know. So in all the sort of experience of being in Britain and, you know, using British language and, you know, there's a part of me that is revolting against that and is trying to hold on to who I am. So I'm a Trini, even though I live in Britain and, you know, I have a British passport. For me, you know, it's something that came out, said to me, Braithwaite, when I first met him, I said to him, you know, I find now I've been in England for like 10 years, and I said, you know what, I find I'm writing more about Trini. And he says, you know, you only become a Caribbean person when you leave the Caribbean, you know? So yeah, I feel very Caribbean, very Trinidadian, in the middle of London, living there. So yeah, it's an interesting space.
That really chimes with me. I think, you know, it's like the Zora Neale Hurston quote that, you know, you only really realize your blackness when thrown up against a sharp white backdrop. I think there's a global point that I think threatened identities become stronger. And for me, and this is not to in any way compare Anthony to the far right or populism, but I can relate to some of these populism movements, because when people feel that their identity is under threat from globalization, from migration, they really become more weaponized identities, stronger, more powerful, and kind of exaggerated identities. And we're seeing identities under threat reasserting themselves, whether that's being a mixed race girl in a white part of London, or a Trini in London, or whether it's white people in a town in Britain that they feel is being overtaken by Muslims. You know, it's that sense of your identity being threatened that can make the identity resurgent. So I think it's really important to understand that, because it's a phenomenon that is happening everywhere. Just to answer Josh's point, one of the criticisms I've had about my book from British journalists, not to cast you under the same brush, Josh, is that I should do more to make British people feel good about how much progress they've made in not abusing black and brown people anymore. And I just find that so fascinating, because, you know, they say, you know, black people don't get beaten up in the streets every day anymore. There aren't signs saying no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. You know, you could have done more to praise the progress that's been made. And I'll just leave you with that thought. I probably don't need to tell you what I said in response. You can work it out.
Very regrettably, I've seen the sign that says time up. So that really is all we've got time for. But thank you so much to the panelists and to those who asked questions.